Hey guys, welcome back to the Way UK podcast. My name is Michelle and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host,
Zoe.
Yay!
Hello.
And today we'll be diving into a wonderful friend's incredible story. Welcome, Jordan Deen.
Guys, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming
I
on.
want to interview you.
Oh,
This is not joking. No.
We can switch it
I
up
submit
later.
to your leadership, but this is so fun to be here today. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man, it's such a joy to have you on. And we're matching.
They are matching, literally completely.
Literally matching.
They both even have
There wasn't
loafers
even
on.
an email, but loafers,
No, I just rung you up this
blue
morning.
denim.
Apart
We're in the
from
blue as well. This
I
is
am.
Same vibe.
Light wash.
Come on now.
we're all cross legs.
Oh, we are
This
across
is
there.
Very
is great.
sophisticated. Hey, interrupting your podcast session here, but just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. If you are listening in on our YouTube, make sure to subscribe. But if you are listening in on our Spotify and Apple podcast, then make sure to follow us and give us a little rating because we want these podcasts to reach as many people. Because our vision here at The Way is to share the good news of Jesus with every young person online. Anywho, without further ado, get back into that podcast. For those who don't know you, please can you share a bit of your story, who you are? Tell us a little bit about yourself and we can dive in.
I'd love to, yeah. Well, my name's Jordan, and I'm born and raised in Slough,
Come on, Slough.
England. Do you know where Slough is? Have you been to Slough?
I've been to
No.
Slough.
It's
never been.
paradise. so,
How many people have
so
said
if
that?
you- Just me for now. So I highly recommend. No, what I typically find is a lot of people have not been to Slough, but they've been through it. People will be like, oh yeah, no, that's how I got to Windsor. And so a lot of the time, depending on how insecure I feel, sometimes I'll be like, yeah, I'm from Windsor. I'm from near Windsor. Or I tell people I'm from London. But the truth is I'm born and raised in Slough. In fact, my mum got married at the age of 26. In fact, on her 26th birthday, she gets told, you're going to get married next week. It was an arranged marriage. How old are you girls right now?
22.
22.
Okay, sweet. Imagine getting told on your
Boys.
birthday, happy birthday, getting married next week. You know, she's in her 20s. She's training to be a nurse, living in Pakistan. And then a week later meets her husband at the altar. And then he has to move back to England. And so her first year of marriage was long distance. And then he'd visit once or twice. Second time he visits, she gets pregnant with me. And then she moves back to England and still doesn't really know this guy. But the location that they end up picking is Slough. That's where my dad was born and raised. His parents had moved from India, I think in the 60s, Pakistan and India in the 60s. So he was born and raised in Slough. And my mum moves to England and has to try and figure this thing out. And so I'm born, and then my little brother's born. And essentially 2 years in, my mum comes to realize that my dad, this man who she thought was incredible, this man who she trusted her parents had set her up with, would be a good man. It turns out that he'd actually had a really troubled life and had, almost a decade of mental illnesses and a drug addiction and just a really, really troubled, difficult life. And she realized that that's who she was married to. And so very quickly came to realize that she was going to be raising my brother and I by herself. And so the story of my life is that God has been so faithful that even though it felt like the odds were all against myself and my family, he has still taken us on a really beautiful, redemptive story where, I grew up without a father, and yet I can stand here today and say that I know exactly what it means to be a son and what it means to have a father through God.
See.
And so, yeah, oftentimes when people say, well, what's your story? Which is such a funny thing to say, isn't it? When someone says, what's your story? You kind of go, do you want me to tell you what happened at 7? Or where do you go with that?
Yeah.
Right.
How in depth do you go? And so I was like, if I was to condense my story into one line, what would I say? And it truly would be that God in his kindness used friendship and the church to restore and to redeem love for me.
Wow.
And so that's my story.
That's
Dude,
amazing.
there's so much to unpack in that.
Yeah.
Just the bar that you just said now, that hit me in the heart. Wow, still growing up without a father yet. Still knowing, what it is to be a son. Like that's so powerful.
Yeah.
But dude, I wanted to like ask, like, how did you come to faith? Like, how did you come to know this God that's fathered you?
Yeah. Very privileged in that I grew up with a really rich exposure to faith because of my mum. And so it's I think what's fascinating is that, you know, I grew up with quite a contrasted image of life where I knew about the realities and the darkness and the brokenness of life through the experiences with my dad. But then I also came to learn about the beauty and the wonder and the goodness of God through my mum.
Wow.
My mum's an absolute prayer warrior. And so
Come on.
it's interesting. I think I could say this, and I do believe this is true. There isn't a day of my life that has gone by that she's not prayed every single morning and night for me, you know,
Wow.
which is kind of a wild statistic for you.
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
But through my mum, you know, I was introduced to the idea and then the reality of God
Wow.
from a very young age. And she kept my brother and I in church, you know, even though there was a lot of chaos in the house, we were in church every single Sunday. And I think I was introduced to Jesus from a young age. And I think where the nuance is the Jesus I was introduced to was a slightly distorted version of Jesus. I grew up in a Pakistani Indian church, and God bless them, services were 3 hours long. You know, you'd get in at 3, and if you're lucky, you'd leave at 7 p.m. So they're very long services, and sometimes there'd be a prayer meeting that would go all night once a month, and then there'd be these weekly Bible studies, and that would be the rhythm for me as a child, just because my mum would take us there.
Right.
But I think what it had formed in me was an understanding of Jesus, which is completely in line with a lot of kind of Pakistani Indian culture, which is, you know, at best really respectful, but sometimes the shadow side of it can be really performative, where you go to parties and if you don't say hello and to every uncle and auntie, you're the talk of the town the next day or whatever. And so in church, what that meant was, you know, making sure that you presented yourself in a certain way, the way that you dressed, the way that you spoke, the way that you respected people, the posture that you had in church. And so I'd come to learn how to be really good at playing the Christian game. And I came to learn how to, you know, please this version of Jesus. But actually it wasn't until I got to my teenage years where I started to meet people who would kind of agitate that understanding of Jesus slightly, but in a really beneficial way for me, where I came to actually understand the goodness and the kindness and the grace of who Jesus really is.
And are these Christian friends?
These are Christian friends. Yeah.
Amazing.
These are people who are slightly older than me, but
Right.
just decided that they were going to love on me and be really, really intentional with me. But what's funny is, you know, the thing I love the most is, and the three of us sat here today, we're storytellers. And so we love stories. We were just talking earlier before this recording even began about how we feel about movies and theater. And there's something about when you're sat down watching a story that it has this ability to just arrest you, like captivate you. You're sat there and you're like, this is, everything else doesn't matter right now. This story is the thing that matters. And I think we all come to realize at one point that God is a storyteller and he is the perfect storyteller, and he writes these beautiful stories, you know, but he's so intentional and he's slightly humorous in the way that he'll be so particular in the way that he redeems stories. And so it's funny, as a child, you know, I'm going to 3-hour services, I'm going to a Bible study every week, and I'm going to an all-night prayer every month. And in my head, I'm like, this stuff is not good. This stuff is bad. This is, you can call it whatever you want. And yet the Lord redeems it and gets to show me the joy of it. That 20 years later, I go to church services that will sometimes last 3 hours, and I'll go to a Bible study, and I'll go to sometimes an all-night prayer meeting, and yet there is so much joy in that. And I think the transition from childhood to adulthood was Jesus becoming a person to me rather than an idea.
I feel like I'm being like spoken to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's awesome.
What was that process? What did that process look like? I know that you mentioned like these friends came into my life, and then now like the whole, you know, growing up in this specific culture of high honor and all of that, to now like experiencing Jesus as a person. I know that those two don't really match, but I'm just like, how did that all happen? Like, I know that it's definitely not an overnight thing, you know, there's a process within that. And I think like you can, I just wondered like, how the heck did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the perfect question. How did it happen? And I would just argue, I think it's still happening and continuing to happen. I think it's going to happen until I'm 99. But I think it's less, how did it happen? Jordan Deen, what did you do? And I think it's more so God coming through on his promises. You know, Psalm 68, I believe it says, he is a father to the fatherless. And then at the end, it says, God puts the lonely into families. And I just think that's, and the passage says that's who God is in his holy dwelling. That's who he is. You know, that's just what he does. And so this idea of my story being one where it's a story of abandonment and loneliness, and even in high school, you know, growing up, perhaps experiencing bullying or being, you know, not welcomed into friendship circles or whatever, that really grieves the heart of God. And when he looks down, I really do believe that he looks down and goes, I'm going to be faithful to my promise, which is I'll be a father to the fatherless. I'll put the lonely into families. And so there wasn't a special thing I did. There wasn't a formula that I followed. It was purely God's kindness. And I get to sit here today with so much assurance that if there's ever anyone going through a season feeling lonely or going, I grew up without a father, I don't know what it means to be fathered, there is such a delightful anticipation within me to be like, what a beautiful journey that you have ahead for you. Because God's going to come through on his promise. What you think you're the first person in the history of humanity that God's not going to come through on a promise for.
Yeah.
You know?
That's so good.
It's amazing.
Man, and how has that impacted the way that you see the Father now?
Yeah. Oh, you're professionals. I can tell, you know? I mean, in every way, it has impacted the way I see the Father. I was thinking about this on my way up to the studio today. I remember when I was growing up, I had heard the concept of God being Father. And there was a very particular moment at the age of 8 when my father walked away from my brother and I was speaking to an uncle of mine. And in that moment, I remember expressing a level of sadness and a level of grief in the fact that my dad wasn't around. And this uncle had essentially said, well, you know, God is your father. I remember in that moment feeling like, that's so lazy of you to say that. It felt like he was kind of fobbing it off, the responsibility.
Like a blanket statement.
And hear me out, I do believe that it is up to us, the body of Christ, to step in when there are deficits in people's lives. You know, I believe God invites us to live this compelling life, but where there's lack in our friends or in our family, we get invited in to help meet that, you know. But at the same time, I remember just hearing that and being like, that's frustrating to hear. Because you've just said now, God is my father, and I do not resonate with that in any way. And that actually doesn't help. So for a very long time, I'd heard the idea and I didn't think it was a lie. I definitely believed it was true, but I guess it's kind of like how I don't follow the sport of cricket. So if you told me, man, England just made the Ashes, if that's technically correct, England just made the Ashes, I'd be like, sick, man. Cool, man. But if you tell me that Arsenal are in the Champions League final, like, I'll take the day off work, you know, like, to celebrate. Like, there is something, because I really resonate with it. Like, it actually does something to me. And so in that moment when he said, God is your father, I remember just being like, this is white noise. These are empty words. And so for me, the real journey has not been Jordan Deen grows up without a father, but then is successful in his career or does this thing over here, or I think that's almost the easy story. You know, we talked about it earlier that I said, I now stand here today and I can say I'm a son with a father. I think sometimes people think what redemption looks like, and this is very, very common, is I grew up without a father, therefore I'm going to prove him wrong and be the father that he wasn't. Or my dad left my mum to raise us, and so I'm going to get really rich and buy her a house. And I look at that and I'm going, that's really sweet, but I don't know if that's true redemptive potential. I think true redemptive potential is to stand firm in your identity and go, even though I went without, the Lord is my shepherd and I lack nothing. Even though I grew up without a father, I know what it means to be fathered. You know, I'm like that. Those kind of stories excite me. I'm like, great, amazing, you bought your mum a house, sick. But I'm like, but do you know who you are? you know?
Mm.
And so for me,
Oh.
the story isn't that Jordan Deen grew up without a
Wow.
dad, but look what he accomplished. I'm like, Jordan Deen grew up without a father, and he couldn't see God as father. And yet God in his kindness took me on this journey where I've gone from essentially a spiritual orphan to a divine son.
Wow.
So to answer your question, it's impacted it massively.
Yeah.
Goosebumps to that, bro.
You are such an eloquent speaker.
Yeah,
I just wanted
you
to
really
know that.
are.
You're amazing.
It's
Mm.
all fake. You know, none of this is true.
Fake it till you make it.
Uh,
No, but what you were saying earlier as well really just resonated about how when you were growing up going to church, you felt the need to kind of perform and that you didn't see Jesus as a person, as the Son of God, but
Yes.
but as an idea of this person that you have to please, just how everybody around you was making you feel like you have to dress a certain way. And I think like that can be so true for so many people, like who have been raised in Christian families, but don't necessarily resonate with the faith in their heart yet because of the idea that's been presented that, oh, actually to be a Christian, you need to do this and do this and do this and do this. It's like a message of doing and being somebody that you're not and ignoring all of the like true human feelings that we experience. But I think it's so beautiful that God met you and like broke down those walls and broke down the facade that you need to be this perfect person and you need to dress this way and speak this way and greet every single person in this church and you have to stay for 4 hours in the service. Like it's like tackling legalism and
yes.
like
So good.
literally everything that, not everything Jesus stood for, but
Yeah.
like I'm just reminded of Jesus and the Pharisees in the Bible where he would heal on Sabbath and he would tell a layman to get up and walk and say your sins are forgiven, and these Pharisees would be like, that's not right, no, 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 no. But it's like everything that Jesus stood for is knowing him first and being a child of him first. And I just wanted to share, I just love that you shared that and that's such a like central part of your story. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say that is amazing.
I mean, that's super good. And that's exactly who God is and what he does is he redeems us. He restores us.
Yeah.
The way that we're wired. And the way that we're wired can come from so many different things. Our upbringing, our friendship circle, the cities that we live in, you know. And so, you know, we're in London right now. London wants to form us in London's image.
Right.
Which is strive, prove yourself, prove that you are enough, hide the things that people shouldn't know, you know. And so you take that and then you take your family of origin of how you were raised to see what love is, or like I said, for me, it was very performative. It was very much say the right things, do the right things, make sure that when you're seen, you're doing this, and when you're unseen, I don't really care what you're up to. And then that just bleeds into how you view Christianity. And I think what Jesus does is so beautiful. He transforms us from the inside out. So he goes, oh, the darkest parts, I care about who you are behind closed doors. I care about, you know, the stuff that you're carrying when your head hits the pillow and you feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. And so then he redeems that, you know, he rewires us, which is so beautiful. And so I completely agree. I'm like, that's who he is.
Yeah. And how have you nurtured that that place behind closed doors? How do you sow into that place of knowing that your identity is in Jesus and as a son of God, not who London's telling you to be or who New York is telling you to be? As we'll go into, you're moving to New York, which is super exciting. But it's like,
thank you.
How do you stay grounded and rooted in the truth of your identity and not allow the noise of the city that you're living in or the job that you're doing or the friendship group that you're in to fully inform who you are?
Yeah, totally. I think I'd say two things to that. I think the first thing is we as people need to be seen and need to be heard by a person. Like there is something about when you're carrying the weight of something that when you finally share it with someone, it's like, oh, I feel so relieved now, you know? And I think one thing I've come to learn is the only way that it will work for you to experience that with Jesus is if Jesus is a person to you.
Mm.
And so if Jesus is just an idea, it's not going to work, and you're going to find yourself just bleeding on other people
Yeah.
Mhm.
because it doesn't work going to Jesus because he's still an idea. But the
Mm.
moment Jesus becomes a person
Mhm.
who you sit with and you come to learn, you're the person who can actually carry this.
Mm.
That actually, that brings rest to my soul.
Mm.
That when I come to you and I share what's really going on, like the stuff
Mm.
behind closed doors, not only do you welcome it, but
Mm.
you can actually hold it, and you hold me.
Mm.
And there is a rest and a delight and a peace and just a reassurance that comes with that.
Mm.
And so for me,
Mm.
how has that happened? It's Jesus has increasingly more and more become a real person to me,
Mm.
where I'm like, this isn't,
Yeah.
I'm not imagining this.
Yeah.
I'm not going,
Mm.
man, what a great practice to just sit and kind of just meditate and just hope that.
Mm.
I'm like, no,
Something would change.
I'm
Yeah.
literally sat with a person going, Jesus, I need you to hold this for me because
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
hold this by myself.
Yeah.
But then I think the second thing is just realizing the components of, or you mentioned, how are you making sure that London doesn't transform you into the image of London?
Mm.
And it's funny, I think, we read the Bible and we look at the life of David and we sometimes go, I'm David, like I'm David,
I'm him.
Slough is essentially looking after the sheep, and where God has me next is my Goliath, and I need to slay Goliath,
Mm.
And I feel like I constantly hear God being like, dude, I don't need you to be David, man. I don't need you to slay any Goliaths. I don't even need you to go to battle and be brave and kill a 7-foot giant or anything.
Mm.
But rather look at the life of Daniel. When you look at the life of Daniel,
Wow.
Daniel lived in Babylon. And of course, we know in the Bible that Babylon was a city. But right now we know Babylon as a system. Babylon still bleeds into the cities that we're in.
Mm.
And I just feel Jesus being like, dude, you can be like Daniel, where you live in the city, you immerse yourself in it, you're friends with people.
Mm.
But also, when you look at the life of Daniel, he lived faithfully to God,
Yeah.
and he lived subversively to Babylon. And
Wow.
so
Yeah.
the things that London wants me to engage with, I get to subvert it. I get to say no to things, but I get to say yes to Jesus. But that doesn't mean I separate myself from the people. It means I immerse myself in it.
Mm.
And you read the life of Daniel, and he had favor with God and he had favor with kings.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about Christians where I'm like, we get to live in these beautiful cities, and we get to have favor with the coffee shop owner, and we get to, you know what I mean? I'm like, we just get to enjoy these cities, and we don't have to kind of go, right, I'm going to sit in my corner and not, it's like, no, embrace the place that God has placed you. But to go back to how do you ground yourself, I think God has been teaching me in the last 2 years, what it really means to have an audience of one. And I think I heard that phrase when I was younger, and it felt more like an Instagram bio, just living for an audience of one. Me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is it though? I don't know. And I think for so long, God has just exposed to me that the amount of times I'll do things and I'll do it as if only God's watching, but I know someone's watching. And so it's funny, there have been times over the last year where he's kind of taught me the hard way of what it means to live for an audience of one. I remember I was out having coffees with some friends, and then at the end I paid the bill, and then one of the friends walked up and thanked my mate. They're like, "Oh, thanks for the coffees, Murray," and then just walked off. And I was like, "Why are you thanking Murray? I bought it." And I felt God being like, "You didn't do it in secret then, did you? If you needed the praise."
Oh wow, yeah.
And I think with the whole concept of the audience of one, I think it's less about, ticking a box, being like, yes, I live for an audience of one. And I think it's an opportunity to see it as a moment where you get to truly love Jesus. And so I often think about, have you ever heard of the song, What Makes You Beautiful by One Direction? Right?
Yeah.
So have billions of others.
Yeah.
But have you ever heard the demo Better Man by Murray Reed? I don't think you have, but I have. And there is something really special about the fact that my mate, who is an artist, has given me access. So only I have access to this demo that you guys might hear in 3 years, maybe next year, but right now it's mine. And there is something about the way that when you live for an audience of one, which is God being your audience, there is an intimacy that is built, because you're like, this billions of people don't have access to this, but you do. And so even when you think about London, I'm like, how does London measure success? It is how many people have seen it? Is it growing? It's always more, big, up and to the right. And yet there is something quite upside down about when you live for an audience of one, it's not about how many people can see it, but how few. And you're like, if I write a song tomorrow and only God hears it, is that okay? I think it's more than okay. I think that's beautiful. And I think God goes, you did that for me.
Oh,
So yeah.
that's so sweet.
Yeah, Jordan, I mean, I love how you've touched on, the audience of one and experiencing God as a father. But then you also briefly mentioned before about how the church stepped in to help you experience like God, but then also like Jesus as a person. I was just wondering, do you have any stories?
And so there are moments scattered, from my childhood right up until today, and I do believe will continue to, where God has just been so kind and shown his generosity and provision and faithfulness through his people, through the church. And that's a big reason why, even to this day, I have such a love for the church. It's because there is so much beauty that comes from it. And I even remember in my teenage years, I was part of a small church in West London, and there was no youth ministry. And so one of the people in the church decided that they would take anyone under the age of 16 to this church in central London, which was this big church with a really thriving youth ministry. And I'd been listening to worship music my entire life. I grew up, I say I was raised by Irene Dean and Darlene Check, if you guys know who that is. Such a rogue one, such a rogue thing to say on this. Anyway, but yeah, my mum raised us listening to worship music and put us into guitar lessons as young kids. And so music and worship played a huge part. But at the age of 16, when I started going to this church in central London through the youth ministry, there were so many of those deficits that started to be met. Even practically, I remember there was a Christmas where money was really tight and the church blessed my mum with this huge Christmas hamper, and they drove all the way, like they sent some people to drive all the way to Slough just to take it to our doorstep and go, Merry Christmas, this is for you. Hope you have a great Christmas. But I think one story that will forever mark me was I was 19 years old. And at this point, I'd actually started working for that church. And I was about a month in, and there was this is so niche, but there was a fragrance that I really, really loved. And I remember I once wore someone else's, and then some people walked in and was like, who smells amazing? And I was like, right, this is my fragrance from now on. I'm going to start wearing this. And I was saving up for it. And I was in a staff meeting and I walked by this one guy and he was wearing it. And we'd never spoken before, but I just went, you're wearing, I said the name of the fragrance. And he goes, nice to meet you. And he goes, I'm Jacob. And I'm like, I'm Jordan. I'm like, you're wearing it. And he goes, yeah, I am. And I told him, I was like, mate, my mum and I are saving up because we're going to buy that for me for Christmas. And he's like, that's really sweet. Bear in mind, him and I have never spoken before. But the following couple of weeks, every time I'd see him at staff meeting, he'd kind of go, and I'd go, you're wearing it again. And I was like, you smell great. And then the week before Christmas, he comes up to me in church and he goes, I got something for you. And he hands me a full bottle of this fragrance.
Whoa.
And this fragrance is like 300 quid. And I'm like, mate, I actually can't accept this. I was like, this is too expensive. But also, my mum and I are already saving up for it. He's like, you need it more than I do. I'm married, you're not. Take it. And I was like, great. What a way to receive a gift. I was like, all right, mate, I'll take it then.
He's helping you out.
I got to say, that day I was complimented and affirmed by everyone. And I still wear it to this day, by the way. But I remember he gifts that to me and then got his number. We formed a friendship. He was about 10 years older than me. And he was a big part of the men's ministry. And then he invited me. He was like, mate, Tuesday night we're hosting ping pong at this local spot. Come through. And at that point I was living in Battersea. So I was about 15 minutes away from that spot. So I go, and then at the end of the night, he's like, let me drop you home. And I'm like, mate, no, it's a 10-minute train, 15-minute train back home. And he's like, behave, get in the car. I'm driving you home. And what should have been a 15-minute drive, he kept taking the wrong left turns or whatever, became just a 45-minute heart-to-heart conversation.
Wow.
And at that point, I'd gotten really good at creatively, avoiding talking about my dad with people. I'd very quickly brush by it, or I'd kind of deflect the question back and go, tell me about your parents or whatever.
Mm.
And he just kept poking, he kept nudging, he kept going, no, tell me about your dad. I need to know this. And so for the first time, again, I've never rehearsed this.
Mm.
So I just word vomit in this car
Mm.
and tell him everything. And then he kind of pauses and just lets it breathe for a second. And then he goes ahead and tells me his story. And it was a story of him and his father. And again, like you don't compare pain, but he'd had a far more tragic upbringing. But his story was that he'd reconciled with his father. And he said, look, man, this is a painful journey that I'm inviting you into, but it's a really important one.
Mm.
And I think you need to get back in touch with your dad. And I said to him, I was like, I don't think you understand. I'm never going to speak to my dad again.
Mm.
And he's like, you're going to call him this year. And 6 months later, I call my dad. And it
Wow.
was all because of this one man who continued to just go on that journey with me.
Mm.
And so it's funny. It's like, you talk about the practicals. I'm like, that is someone who took me on the deepest journey I've ever been on in my life, who went out of his way. And a few years later, I end up finding out from him that actually what happened is a few of the leaders had been scheming, and my boss, Dan, he'd spoken to some of the pastors and been like, look, I've got this guy working for me, but there's something wrong. And he won't open up to anyone. How do we do this? And they go, send Jacob. Jacob's going to be the one to crack. And so they send Jacob. So these guys had been scheming to get me to talk. And so Jacob
Wow.
takes me out for a drive. And again, I'm like, that is the church coming together to go, how do we meet this guy in the deepest way, but in the most important way? And so it's funny, it's been again, like the hamper at Christmas. Even when I think about the church just being the body of Christ, not even just necessarily one organization, but just people around. I'm like, even over the last few years, I've had people be like, I live in California and I would love to host you. Why don't you come for 2 weeks and stay with me? And I'm like, I've never been to America. And they're like, no, it's fine. Like, we'll look after you. We'll host you.
Mm.
Or it's been, my friend's dad in California, actually, had a moment a couple years ago, which was so, again, I said this earlier, but the Lord has such a fun sense of humor where he's so intentional in the way that he tells stories. But when I was 16, or perhaps when I was 15, I think it was 16. When is it that you can start learning how to drive? Is it 16?
17.
17.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So 10 years before that, I'm 7 and I'm with my dad. This is before he'd left. And I'm in a car with him and I'm like, can you teach me how to drive? And he goes, absolutely. The moment you turn 17, I'll teach you how to drive. And so I'd been holding on to this promise from my dad.
Mm.
And then, of course, when I'm 10 or 9, he leaves. And so then by the time I get to 17, I'm like, I don't want to learn how to drive. Like, my dad was meant to teach me. And so it was this like wound that I'd kind of just hidden. And people would be like, have you learned how to drive yet? Or are you taking lessons? And I'd be like, no, like, and I had all these excuses. But the truth was I was carrying this like wound with me. And so didn't want to learn how to drive. And then it's funny, like I get to 22 and I'm in California and my friend's dad had just got a new car. And I was like, what's it like to drive? And he goes, well, come on, I'll take you for a spin. So I thought he's going to drive. And then he hands me the keys. I'm like, you do realize I don't drive. I don't know how to drive.
Mm.
And he's like, I'll teach you. And so I'm
Wow.
in California and he lets me drive his brand new car. And we get to some clear roads and he's like, right, floor it now. Now we can go really fast. And I'm like, this is so cool. And he's like, all right. And then I almost hit a truck and he's like, oh, maybe not. And I'm like, this is super not allowed, but thank you. But I remember in that moment being like, man, God just met 7-year-old me,
Mm.
or even like my cousin Leon. I remember once we were at the petrol station and he's like, oh, I just got a flat tire. You've ever pumped a tire before? And I'm like, no. He's like, today's the day. And he just teaches me how to pump a tire.
Mm.
Or like, again, these are all these fathers who have stepped in and just reconciled and redeemed and restored what I missed out on in my childhood.
Mm.
And so it's funny, like recently back in November, I just celebrated 5 years of freelancing. And
That's awesome.
Wow.
there was a
Congrats.
moment where I was kind of like, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a swipe post of all my, 10 of my best projects over the last 5 years.
Mm.
And I immediately felt God be like, but then you'd be telling the story that's not the actual story,
Mm.
I remember I stumbled across this article and it was Film Plots Explained Badly. And it's like a picture of Spider-Man and it's like freelance photographer tries to make it in New York City, or Inception, it's like people take naps or things like that, just people explaining movies really, really badly.
Yeah.
And I felt God being like, to post a swipe post of your best projects of the last 5 years is to explain the film plot badly. Like, what's the real story that's been written? When I sat with it, I think I realized I stepped into freelancing thinking like God was going to establish me in my adulthood. But the truth is, these last 5 years, he was redeeming and he was restoring my childhood, you know?
Mm.
And there are all these moments that have happened over the last 5 years through the church where things that have happened from the age of 7 or things that have happened at the age of 14 or in the last 5 years, God's been like one by one in the most unique, niche way. I'm just going to redeem little things that if you were to ever share it with people, they'd be like, but I'm like, but you know, deep down, you know that the fact that this thing happened is like your childhood being restored. So yeah, that's why I always say God used the church and he used friendship to restore love for me.
Wow. That is so beautiful. I'm like emotional right now.
Yeah, me too. I'm like holding back tears, bro. I'm like
literally holding on. That is incredible. I think that's so beautiful how your friends and Jacob like pursued you, how Jesus pursues us.
Yes.
And how it's like just the church is so beautiful because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to come alongside our brothers and sisters and pick them up when they're down and help them realize this wound that they need to deal with and this wound that needs healing that they might not want to deal with. That's like literally what Jesus does. He's a healer and he reveals to us what needs to be touched, what needs to be redeemed. And that is, I'm just really, really touched by that. And also to link back to what you were saying earlier about the audience of one, I'm sure that they were doing that for God. They were doing that because they,
so true.
in their hearts, were wanting to please God and love God and reflect the love that they'd received from Jesus onto you.
Yeah.
Of course, they were doing it because they love you, but they weren't doing it to impress you.
No.
That is so authentic that it's like true love that is from the fountain of love, which is God.
Yeah.
And I'm just really keen to know how the idea of God as your audience has impacted and influenced how you work and present yourself through your creativity and in your freelancing.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so well. The story of my life, everything I've experienced so far, the kindness of others, had to be them doing it for an audience of one, because this is 19-year-old broken me. You know, I wasn't Bitcoin. You know, I wasn't this like hot thing where it was like, you invest in this and the returns will be good. It was like people kind of being like, I don't even know if this is going to work, but I just feel God being like, man, I need to like reach out to this kid. So again, it wasn't Bitcoin. It was honestly like damaged goods is what it felt like. And someone being like, I just feel God said, I need to invest in this kid. And so I've been the recipient of that. But I think that the beauty of the story that God's writing is he heals us and then he invites us into the story where we then also get to play that part for others as well. I remember hearing this quote a couple of years ago, which was, our scars can become lighthouses for those heading towards the same rocks that we hit. And for me, that's what gets my heart on fire, to go, oh, there are now other people who are heading towards the same rocks that young Jordan hit. Now, like, if I can, God, use me to be a lighthouse, to be like, there gets to be a different story for you. Because that's exactly what I experienced. And then to answer your question, like, how does that bleed into my work? I'm like, it does 100%, not like 10% when I get a chance. I'm like, everything about the way that I've oriented my life is to be able to be of service to others, because that's exactly what I experienced. And so, these last 5 years, the thing that I've specialized in is storytelling and brand strategy. And what I love is I get to work with so many different churches because I decided I always want to be a part of what God's doing through the church. He's writing a really beautiful redemptive story through his church. And I'm like, God, I want to be in it, But then even when I get to work with companies or personal brands or artists or whatever it may be, I'm realizing they're inviting me into a very vulnerable conversation, which is about identity. Branding is identity, it's reputation. And in that moment, I get to affirm the truest thing about them. Artists will believe the truest thing about them is their last biggest project or their biggest success or their failures. And I get to step in and go, that is not actually the truest thing about you. There is actually a better story being written with your life. And so, you know, at the age of 21, I got to a point, and I consider myself really privileged to say this, but I believe at 21, God gave me a download to go, this is what I want you to give the rest of your life to, which I realize I'm really fortunate. Some people will realize that in their 50s or their 60s, but he simply just gave me an ache. I feel God said, you know, there are so many other lost boys out there. There is such an orphan spirit that is plaguing the world right now. And when you look at the fact that there are fatherless homes on the rise, but also just parents spending less time with their kids right now, I'm like, there is this spiritual orphanhood that is both obvious but also hidden in families and homes across the world. And so I feel God being like, I want that ache to be the thing that I'm commissioning you to just do anything and everything with. And so it's beautiful. I don't feel God saying, hey, the calling of your life is to be in this organization or to do this one thing. I feel God being like, I'm giving you an ache and I'm commissioning you. You go do whatever you want to do. Because when God gives you an ache, then, you know, you can operate in any room that you're in. You know, right now, I'm in this room right now, and this gets to be a main event, not a pre-event to the main event, which is happening later on. And so it's beautiful because it means if I'm going for a one-to-one coffee, or if I'm speaking at an event, or if I'm on the Way UK's podcast, you know, which, hello, this is a massive deal. But whatever it may be, God is saying every single one of these moments is holy. Every single one of these moments, you get to engage in this missional heart that I've given you towards the fatherless and towards the orphan spirit. So you mentioned it earlier, but in 8 days, I moved to New York City.
That's awesome.
And I've been a Slough boy, you know, so Slough to Manhattan's quite the transition.
Yeah.
But I really do believe I'm moving there because, again, God has continued to deepen the ache for the orphan spirit. And there is such a beautiful community out there who is meeting that orphan spirit and who is proclaiming a different narrative over them. And I think about New York, and I think about the amount of people who move there with a dream, with a vision for their life. And they, again, are claiming the identity that the truest thing about them is their skill set, or it's their brilliance, or it is their success in this corporate venture, whatever it may be. And I just get to be part of this family out there who are going, no, there's a much more compelling story being written with your life, and just remind people of that.
That is awesome.
Wow. Jordan, bro, we are running out of time, unfortunately. But to close, I was wondering if you could pray for those listening, and for those who needed to hear what you've just shared.
I would love to. This has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for having me.
I love you,
I'd
bro.
love to pray Psalm 68:5
Cool.
over everyone.
Yeah.
A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. Father, I thank you so much that because of you, because of your kindness, because of your grace, because of your mercy, because of the person of Jesus, the story that we start out with does not need to define the story that we go on to live. And I thank you so much that you are a father to the fatherless, that to all of us who carry an orphan spirit, who perhaps feel like we don't know who we are, or we don't know what it means to be loved and accepted, you write a different narrative for us. And I thank you that you set the lonely into families. I thank you that this is just who you are. And so I pray for people who are listening today, who relate with that ache, and I just declare a new identity over them. I pray that they would experience you as Father, and I pray that they would get to enjoy and delight in the redemptive story that you have for them, where you get to set the lonely into families. Thank you for loving us. In your name I pray. Amen.
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 Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Thank you guys for tuning
Thanks,
in.
guys. What a joy.
Yeah, what a joy. And we'll see you guys in the next podcast.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.